Good day. Again, you've joined me for another grammar lesson. This is English 030 and 101. My name is Professor Oliver, and today we'll be discussing how to create eye-catching introductions. Because introductions help us to indeed engage our readers so that they want to read our text more. And so there's nothing worse than beginning a text and finding out very early on that it's boring and that you are not interested. It's actually a very difficult process to endure indeed. So you want to always make sure that you're catching your reader's interest early and making sure that you are holding on to them throughout their reading of your text so that they leave wanting more and not necessarily needing more because you've provided them what they needed, but wanting more because your writing was so fabulous and engaging. So the first thing we want to think about are some of the very basic qualities of an introduction. Introductions need to be engaging on all levels, and that layer of engagement means that not only are you keeping the reader's attention, but you're making them think, oh wow, as I read this, I really want to talk to the author more about that. So you are in effect encouraging an interaction with them, even though all they have in front of them is your text. You also want for your readers to create desire to read your text more. And so as they continue reading on, it should not be arduous. They shouldn't think, oh my gosh. And so when you're thinking about kind of some of the statements that you make in your text, like I've already said before, or like I said earlier, you realize that if you have to say that to your readers or write it in your text, that essentially you are pressing the issue. And so you're stating something that shouldn't need to be stated. And certainly if you've got to state that, that means that you are in effect boring us twice. Not a good idea. You also want to be able to set boundaries with your introductions. And so if you've told your reader that you're going to discuss only so many things in your paper, you want to stick to those things. And so if you have gone beyond the promises that you made in your introduction in the rest of your text, you've essentially broken a contract with that reader. And so you want to think about how broad or how narrow a discussion you want to engage in with your readers early on so that you don't fall out of that particular promise that you've made. And then finally, fostering curiosity. Again, once they're done reading your text, they should want to know more. Not necessarily about what you've written, but perhaps about the subject at large. And so in thinking about fostering that curiosity, what would this person say about this? I wonder if we add this other element, how that would change our discussion. Those are the types of things that your writing should encourage when someone is reading it. And so you got to think about that all at the very beginning of your text. There are three very basic parts to an introduction: the hook, the bridge, and the thesis. And we're going to talk about each of those very specifically, but I want to just let you know that your hook is that thing that actually does that. It hooks, and so you want to think about fishing. A fish that is caught on a hook can't get off of it by themselves. And so you want your reader to be hooked by what you've written very early on. So that first sentence or two should definitely engage your readers so that they want to read more, so that they cannot let your text go without finding out what goes on later. Then the bridge does what bridges do. It connects. And so you have to think about connecting what you have thrown at your reader with the hook to what you actually want to prove or show in the essay overall. And then finally, the thesis statement, that helps to establish the scope of your text, and it also helps to explain essentially what you're trying to prove or show when you're writing this essay. And so if you don't yourself know what you're trying to prove or show, it's going to be kind of hard for your readers to follow along because you will essentially just kind of meander wherever your thoughts might take you rather than having a clear direction. So let's talk about those parts of the introduction specifically. The hook. There are a few things that you can do to hook your readers as they continue on this journey with you. And so one of the things that you might also always want to consider is the startling statistic. And we kind of have a joke about statistics that they are essentially only as useful as the shock value that they throw at a reader, but that is the truth. If you give your readers a statistic that engages them, that makes them go, oh, I didn't know that, or oh, wow, I didn't know it was that bad, or oh, I didn't know it was that good, then essentially you made them want to continue further because you have grabbed onto their attention just by sheer virtue of the use of the number or the rate that you've thrown at them. You can also engage your reader by having a joke or a riddle. I mean, who wouldn't want to know the punchline, right? And so if you begin your text in that way, you've kind of, in a very lighthearted or funny manner, introduce your reader to whatever the subject is. And sometimes a joke is a very good way to introduce your reader to something that's very deep or heavy. Not that you're trying to make light of the situation, but sometimes when you start off with something that's a little too heavy, it may be a turnoff by virtue of its very seriousness. Another thing that you might want to consider is the universal experience. A lot of narratives and personal stories begin with the universal experience because it helps your readers to understand and to empathize or sympathize with the scenario that's going on. So if you have, for example, stubbed your toe or lost a loved one or something along those lines, generally people can empathize. They can understand because they have that very universal human connection to that particular experience. And even if they haven't experienced it personally, they probably have someone that they know very close who has experienced it, and so they can empathize by virtue of that relationship. You can also begin your essays, your introductions, with an intriguing quotation. And so a lot of the times students think that they have to begin with something very profound that they themselves have said, and they don't often realize the very value in pulling out someone else's wonderful quote and then expanding on that quote. And so if you're using someone's quote, don't just give us the quote, rather, but recognize that throughout your essay you're going to be referring back so that we are understanding how this quote is relevant. But to just begin with the quote gives the reader an understanding that you know what's going on and you have some greater philosophical message to impart to us. And then finally, excuse me, not finally, but you can also begin your essay with a challenging fact, something that readers just did not know. Very similar in this regard to the startling statistic, a challenging fact might give them a little bit of information that might pique their interest, that might spark their curiosity. So they want to continue reading just to find out where this is going. And then, again, finally, we could also begin our essays or hook our readers with our introductions with a question. And this one is a little bit tricky because oftentimes people think that they have to just ask a question and that's enough. You have to think about when you are presenting a question as far as an introduction or a hook, you have to think about the fact that your entire essay is going to then proceed to answer the question. And so it can't just be a yes-no question, but rather one that requires a little bit of exposition, some analysis perhaps of some terms, some other things that need to go into it because it's not just an easy answer. So when you're thinking about whether or not you should indeed begin your essay with a question, it's kind of a loaded bag, a loaded question to answer. There are a couple things I want you to realize about introductions and their importance, and I don't think that I can underscore this enough because, again, you have to remember that your introduction does things for your text and for your readers that the rest of the text then goes about the business of fulfilling. And so you have to remember that this is a promise to your readers in many ways. So recognize that first impressions matter. When you are beginning your introduction, you have to realize that if you write your introduction poorly, it's not going to bode well on our reading of your material. We might go into it with already a heavy heart or some trepidation because we really just don't want to read anymore. And unfortunately, I have to read. And so imagine getting 26 essays that have poor introductions. Ugh, that's a very heavy load, and it might take me quite a while to get your papers back. So you want to think about your readers as you're crafting these. You also want to think about your introduction as setting a tone. And so the attitude that you have toward the material is definitely reflected in your introduction. So if you don't really know a whole lot about your subject matter, that's fine, but you've got to include information that makes it seem as though you know a lot about it. Okay? And so if you don't know a lot about it, if you're not really enthusiastic, if you're not really feeling this topic, it's going to show in your introduction and then be pervasive throughout the text. Not a good idea. Finally, you want to use your introduction to establish your authority. And as a student, you don't always think about establishing authority. We usually think about that when we're writing research papers and things like that. Some big head professor at some part-time, at some lovely university will, throw out a name or throw out their credentials, and you'll think, oh, that's authority. I really can't do that because I'm just a student. Well, the reality is that everything that you do helps to establish your authority, including making sure that you have an introduction that's engaging and well written. And so if your introductory sentences or your introduction in the whole has problems with the logic or even just sense level issues, I've seen lots of students have grammar problems in their introductions. It really just does not look very good when reading the rest of your essay. So you want to think about that as you're presenting things to your readers, that this is a presentation. Those first impressions matter. Whenever you go to a restaurant and someone puts down a plate of food in front of you, you haven't even tasted it, but the smell is hitting you before you even see it. And the moment you see it, you want it to look good. So we want your introductions to make the rest of your essay look good. So that's the hook. Our bridges, on the other hand, of course, do what bridges do. They connect the hook to the purpose for writing, otherwise known as your thesis statement. When you're thinking about bridges, you have to recognize that your reader may not have the background information that you do, and so you've got to make sure that they're understanding how you got from your hook to your thesis. So whatever it is that you're introducing to us, to whatever it is your attitude is about that. And so your bridge may be several sentences. But you are essentially providing a context for understanding for your readers, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. When you're thinking about context, you have to recognize that readers don't always have the rationale for reading that we do for writing. And so you've got to explain to them what makes something relevant or important to the subject that you are focusing on. And so when you're thinking about context, I always like to draw a little box and put understanding inside that, because ultimately what you're doing is you're keeping your reader inside that box. So if you're writing a story or writing a narrative or writing a comparison contrast, you got to think about your rationale or your reasons for writing and how that relates to your reader. So, just to give you an example, if I'm writing an essay comparing and contrasting some of the causes of the Civil War, I'm not going to pull in science fiction elements and then start talking about Star Trek, even though I love it, because that would be outside of context. I've got to stay inside this box so that I'm making sure my readers know exactly where my boundaries are. So context is very important. And I do recognize that I put why on here twice, but your readers have to know why this is important, who you're writing to, when it's relevant or important, and again, why this is important. So if those things aren't clear at the beginning and end of your bridge, then it's going to make it very hard to see how we got from your introductory or your hook sentence to your thesis statement. So, what can bridges do, or what could bridges be? Well, they could provide background info, a little bit of history, perhaps, maybe some additional facts, you know, when a person was born, what they did, what they focused on. They could also help to define key terms, because we don't always have the same understanding of terms, and so sometimes you might have to take a moment, sometimes in the body of your paper, but a very good spot for it is in the introduction, to just define terms so that we're understanding what you mean when you say. So there are many opportunities for creating a bridge, but again, your bridges help to create context for your readers so that they understand why something is relevant or important.